So at this point in the webinar, we're at part 2. We're discussing the energy analysis, and we're going to start with the baseline energy use case. The baseline for the project represents the do nothing scenario, or the business as usual scenario. In order to do a baseline, there are some things that you will have to have, some must-haves. The main one is going to be utility data. You will need probably at least a year, ideally more than that, worth of utility data. In some cases, which we'll discuss shortly, you might want to weather normalize that data. If there has been a renovation occurred in the past few years, you'll want data at least back to when that last major renovation was. You'll need to know things like occupancy rate and hours of operation. How is the building operating? You'll need to know what equipment is currently there, okay, so the current equipment plus the performance of that equipment. And finally, in order to do a financial analysis, you'll need to know the customer's utility rate structure. How do they actually pay for the energy and water that they're using? So beyond the must-haves, if you're doing a full assessment that requires a building energy model, there might be some other things that you need as well. In some cases, you need weather data, or the files behind that. You might need to know load profiles of the equipment, as well as the layout of the building and the square footage. Some of you are probably asking, what is weather normalizing, or why would I want to weather normalize? And so I'll explain that. Weather normalizing is a technique used to smooth out differences in weather between different years. And we know that in any given year, the weather might be hotter or colder than normal, and that's going to affect how a building uses energy. And so for some measures, for some technologies, weather normalizing can be very important. Specifically, if we're talking about HVAC, heating or cooling, weather normalizing can be extremely important. In hotter years, the building will use more air conditioning. In colder years, the building will use more heating. And you want to smooth out that variation and make sure what your analysis is truly represents normal weather. For lighting, for projects like LEDs, weather normalizing likely is going to have a pretty minor effect. Weather really won't affect your lighting use that much. And then for solar technologies, most of the production models that are out there already consider weather. They already take weather into account. So weather normalizing is really not going to be that important for solar either. When you're doing your baseline, the main piece of advice I would have is that to verify your approach with Texas Pace Authority and with the ITPR, if possible, and you want to do that as early as possible. If you've ever got any questions, is what I'm doing correct? Then please just ask us, and we're happy to help you out with how you should be doing that, the baseline analysis. We can help you figure out whether it requires an energy model or a spreadsheet is okay. And then for certain kind of special cases, which we'll discuss shortly, we can help you with how to actually do the baseline. One thing I do want to mention in the case of distributed generation projects, such as solar, the baseline analysis in those cases is a little bit simpler because your baseline is essentially zero. You're not producing energy currently, and then after the project you will be. But for those projects, you will still need to know what is the building using in terms of electricity so that you can do that cost-benefit analysis. Now I'd like to address two scenarios of projects that are not straightforward in how to do the baseline analysis. In some cases, for some projects, it actually might be more appropriate to use a modeled baseline rather than an actual baseline based on actual utility data. And specifically, I'm talking about two scenarios, both of which I want to address in detail. The first one is if you have a vacant or a partially vacant building which is being redeveloped. And the second scenario is a building repurposing scenario, when you're taking a building and converting it to an entirely new type of use. The first case I want to address is what happens if you have a vacant or partially vacant building. So in this scenario, you've got this building which is vacant or partially vacant. It's going to undergo a redevelopment, some type of project, and then after the project, it's going to be used in the same manner that it was used before. So for example, you've got an office building, it's going to have a project done, and then after the project, it's going to remain as an office building. So in this scenario, your baseline is going to be that you're going to model the building assuming the existing equipment, so the equipment that's in the building right now, but you're going to model it under the expected conditions. So these are what you would call your independent variables. You want to keep these constant. And that's your occupancy, the hours of operation, the load profile of the equipment, for example. Now you can use this technique if you have a limited amount or perhaps no utility data. You do have to know the existing equipment, so what actually is in the building right now. And if some of that existing equipment is missing, you can use an educated guess about what would have been there the last time the building was occupied. So for example, what was the code requirement when the building was last occupied? The next situation I want to address is a building repositioning scenario. So in this case, you've got a building, it's going to undergo a redevelopment, and then after the project, it's going to be used differently than it was before. So for example, if you were converting a warehouse to an office space, what would you do? So for your baseline scenario, you're going to model measures that are going to have to be new to the building. You're going to model those assuming that they are compliant with the current energy code. And you're going to model it operating under your expected conditions. Okay, so hours of operation, occupancy, the load profile, all of those independent variables will be under your expected conditions. What this really means is that your energy savings end up being the amount of savings that your equipment generates above the code compliance levels. The last thing I want to address in this part of the webinar is energy models. If your project is complex enough to require an energy model, typically there's going to be an MEP engineer involved. Energy modeling software is fairly robust and ubiquitous across the industry. The most common ones we see used are eQuest and Energy Plus, the DOE versions. Trane and Carrier both have a building energy model, and DOE also provides a cool roof calculator for projecting savings from roofing projects.